you want to call your witness, please?
I do. Could we get post sidebar briefly?
Yeah.
Yes, right. If we could have Dr. Keith Ablow.
Yes.
Is it Your Honor?
Stand here, face the clerk, and raise your right hand.
Sir, do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give this court and the cause now at hearing should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Is it Your Honor's practice to sequester the other expert just before Dr. Ablow testifies? I would leave it up to your court's judgment.
I would have you offer Dr. Ablow's testimony. If I have questions, I'll certainly ask them.
No, I'm saying Dr. Kelly's in the courtroom now.
Oh, right.
And if this court normally would be sequestering the other
I'm not going to sequester the experts.
Okay, that's fine.
It same holds true for the
Yes, no,
you're free to be here with Dr. Kelly.
Thank you.
I understand. I was just trying to understand your procedures. Please state and spell your name for the court.
Keith Ablow, MD, Keithablow.
And you recall being here testifying
I do.
probably last week relative to competence.
Yes.
And you recall at the time I asked you what your role in this case was, and I'd like you to restate that if you don't mind.
Yes, I interviewed Mr. Alemany and am prepared to testify as to his mental status and whether he was criminally responsible for his acts, as well as other matters at the interface of psychiatry and the law.
And you are aware that I have filed a motion on, counsel has filed a motion on behalf of the defendant under the so-called humane practices rule, correct?
I am aware of that.
And what is your understanding of what that motion is requesting?
Generally speaking, I understand the motion to be that statements made by Mr. Alemany in the aftermath of the crime until this very day and beyond during this process would be considered to be not voluntary.
And you understand that we're specifically referring to two such conversations, correct?
Yes.
An interview that he gave to the police
Indeed.
Shortly after his arrest, and a jailhouse call he made to Elizabeth Stevenson, the mother of his child and his former girlfriend, on Mother's Day this year, correct?
Yes.
And you've had an opportunity to review both statements, yes?
Yes.
And, sir, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty with regard, starting with the interview he gave to the police, the interrogation, whether that in fact was a voluntary act on his part?
Yes, with regard to the interview...
You do have an opinion?
I do.
And what would that opinion be?
With regard to the interview that you reference to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty, I consider that interview and the statements he made during it to be not voluntary.
And with regard, same question for the jailhouse call he made to Elizabeth Stevenson. Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty as to whether the content of that call was in fact his voluntary act?
With regard to the call made to Elizabeth Stevenson that you reference, the content of the call, the statements made by Mr. Alemany, I consider to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty to be not voluntarily made.
As voluntary is generally understood in forensic psychiatry?
That is correct.
And could you strike that? Would your reasons for stating both these opinions be the same?
Yes.
Could you please elaborate and say what those reasons are?
Yes, Mr. Alemany suffers with more than one psychiatric disorder, including a dissociative disorder and an affective disorder, as well as a history of alcohol abuse for years and years. The confluence of these disorders renders him in a...
I'm sorry, I want to interrupt you. I just need to, Doctor. So it's dissociative disorder and affective.
And an affective disorder or major depression with psychotic features in this case.
The affective disorder is depression.
Correct. The confluence of those disorders, including the long-term toll of having taken psychotropic medications and having abused alcohol with its neurotoxic effects on the brain, mean that at any one point in time, Mr. Alemany is groping for facts, trying to assemble a reality that he can share with others so as not to seem as fragmented as he truly is. And so in both of the instances which you describe, I don't believe that he can voluntarily or meaningfully relate facts when questioned or make statements in a legal context.
Are you suggesting that these statements are not the product of a rational mind?
Mr. Alemany is not able to make meaningful statements about his case as the product of a rational mind, no.
You were speaking a moment ago about the neurotoxic effect of long-term alcohol abuse, correct?
Correct.
Could you, in some more layman's terms, describe how that affects the brain and higher brain function?
Well, it's well known that long-term use of alcohol, which, by the way, Mr. Alemany uses to self-medicate, has used in order to try to control these hallucinations he experiences that he finds terrifying. But the overuse of alcohol over a long period of time impairs memory, impairs concentration, and it doesn't do anything in the longer term to quiet those very hallucinations that Mr. Alemany thought that alcohol would be useful for. In fact, long-term alcohol abuse can cause worsening hallucinations and worsening depression. So that triad of alcohol abuse with its neurotoxic effects, major depression, which in his case has psychotic elements, and his dissociative state, which bridges more than one category in the DSM-5, our diagnostic manual, means that when he relates or even agrees to participate in conversations of the two kinds you mentioned, that those aren't voluntarily given.
You used the word psychotic or psychotic features, correct?
Yes.
Do individuals, and more specifically, would an individual sitting at that table, would it be fair to say he would cycle through highs and lows of psychotic behavior?
I think, to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty, Mr. Alemany, auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations.
And you gather this from the, essentially from the historical progression of his medical records since he was a teenager?
Yeah, in this case, we don't have to rely upon Mr. Alemany's report alone. We have thousands of pages of medical records documenting a catastrophic mental illness.
That would include both, would it not, sir, the differential diagnoses that occur at each place as well as the medications?
Yes, there are a wide range of diagnoses, partly due, no doubt, to the imprecision of psychiatry as a field to begin with, but also to the fact that clinicians may not have zeroed in on the precise diagnoses as he moved from one facility to another with so many features: violence, voices, vision, substance abuse, wandering, amnesia, head trauma. All of these things can obscure rather than make plain the underlying diagnosis, which is in fact a dissociative disorder, major depression, and alcohol abuse.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Alemany.
Good afternoon.
How are you, sir?
I am doing well, thank you.
Dr. Alemany, you were first retained in this case when?
Shortly before December 29th of 2014, sometime before December 29th of 2014, which is the first time I visited Mr. Alemany.
And the first time you visited him, I asked you some questions. I think it was on May 14th. I had an opportunity to ask you some questions on that date. There was a hearing here, sir.
Correct.
And you remember me asking you during that hearing if you had access to certain materials on that date?
Yes.
And certainly, one thing you would have had access to on that particular date, Dr. Alemany, is Mr. Alemany's statement, recorded interview with the police, dated July 24th, 2013. You'd agree with me on that?
Yes.
Now, up until the most recent motion was filed regarding the jail call and that statement, you were never asked to opine on the voluntariness of the July 24th, 2013 statement. Isn't that right, sir?
Not specifically, no.
Okay. You didn't?
I did not opine on it.
Correct. You were only asked to opine on the voluntariness of the July 24th, 2013 statement after you had come into receipt of a jail call dated May 10th of 2015, correct?
Correct.
And you had the opportunity to listen to that jail call, sir?
Yes.
And with respect to the jail call, you understand, based on your involvement in this case, your opportunity to interview Mr. Alemany while he was in custody?
Yes.
You're aware that he's been in custody since the date of that original interview, July 24th of 2013?
Yes.
You have a certain level of familiarity, sir, do you not, with interviewing and testifying on behalf of persons who are charged with very serious crimes?
Yes.
You've had the opportunity to do that in settings, secure settings, such as a jail, a house of correction, or even a prison, correct?
Yes.
You'd agree with me, sir, that from July 24th, 2013 to today, in your most recent opinion, at least relative to the jail call, that alcohol isn't served in those facilities, those secure facilities. You'd agree with that, correct?
Correct.
I was handed a report today, or a letter. It's not dated, and it talks about, it's signed by you, you're aware of it, about Mr. Alemany's dependence on alcohol, correct?
Perhaps I should take a look at the letter, as it's about several things if it's the same letter. And I don't know how we lost the date, but it should be today's date, and it obviously wasn't. So maybe someone help me out. My secretary may have helped me out.
Well, let me ask you this: your letter is dated May 7th, correct?
No, sorry. That's the. Hold on one sec. Let's see.
What do you have?
That's it. No, you have this. This is a letter from May 7th, which testifies to the fact that he lacked criminal responsibility. Competency letter. Okay. So that letter is today's. Thank you. And this letter is the one that talks not only about alcohol use and its aftermath, but also other elements of the case.
And is this letter that I'm holding that you just looked at? Is this what you described in your affidavit dated May 20th? And I'll show you the affidavit, sir. I'm sure you recall it. You recognize that document, sir?
Yes.
You just turn to page 2 of that document. And Dr. Alemany, I just let me to you. Paragraph 6 of your affidavit dated May 20th. The letter I just showed you, is that the supplemental report that you reference in this particular affidavit, or is there some other type of report that we're not aware
of? I've written no other supplemental report at this time.
Is that the supplemental report that I just showed you?
Well, I guess I would reserve. It says could I read it? Or yes, I will be filing a supplemental report indicating the rationale for this differential diagnosis, since Mr. Alemany's inability to retrieve memories is idiosyncratic in terms of the length and time of the amnesia he experiences and the shifts in personality he experiences. So certainly the supplemental report, the letter to Attorney Denner that you have in your possession that should be dated today, addresses this. There may be more that I wish to write in the future, but it is in that vein that you receive a copy of the letter I wrote to Mr. Denner.
And currently, it's your expectation that you'll be testifying in this case on Wednesday of this week?
That is my expectation.
And when are you expecting, to the extent there's another report, when are you expecting to file that, sir?
Well, I'm not expecting to file the report unless some moment should arise that precipitates it.
Dr. Abloh, on the issue of voluntariness, it's your testimony that both the statement that he gave on July 24th and the jail call made on Mother's Day of 2015, May 10th, both not voluntary, both for the same reasons, correct?
Correct.
And I don't want to misquote you, but part of your answer is that you said that Mr. Alemany cannot voluntarily or meaningfully relate statements about the case as a product of a rational mind. Did I say that correctly?
I trust that you got that correct, yes.
Okay. Would you at least agree with me that with respect to the May 10th of 2015 phone call, that alcohol did not play a role in that particular call? You've had the opportunity to listen to it.
No.
You wouldn't agree?
No, I wouldn't.
Okay. And what is it about that call that you listened to, sir, that would lead you to say you wouldn't agree that alcohol did not play a role in that call?
If I may, we can differentiate between alcohol use that day.
Well, I think Dr. Abloh will go on.
My testimony, to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty, is that it is the long-term use of alcohol in Mr. Alemany that contributes to this triad of diagnoses that renders him chronically unable to make such statements in a voluntary manner.
So if I understand your testimony, your diagnosis is that he wouldn't necessarily have to consume alcohol at or around the time the call was made, May 10th, 2015. The involuntariness is a byproduct of a long history. Is that what you're saying?
It's a byproduct of a long history and the present toll of the history. So his underlying severe mental illnesses, one of which is alcohol abuse, contributing to the other two, leaves him chronically with acute symptoms, but it's not due to having had anything to drink that day.
Mr. Abloh, can I ask you another question about your affidavit on May 20th?
Of course.
And I just want to show it to you. And I just want you to take a look at paragraph 7. Can you do that for me?
Yes.
And I'm just trying to understand your affidavit, Dr. Abloh. When you write the language that's included in paragraph 7, would that go to the voluntariness of his statements?
I think it is. I think that the paragraph you point out does impact the voluntariness of his statements.
Okay. So when you say that he's made anxious, Mr. Alemany is made anxious by his inability to recall critical information about his actions due to his mental disorders, that he attempts to fill in gaps by reciting information that he's heard from others about his actions or inventing tales about his actions which he thinks might be seen as credible by others.
That is true.
So if he's behaving in that way and you're diagnosing him in that way, then if I understand correctly, what he's saying is actually not voluntary. It's just a byproduct of that, correct?
Help me understand the question a little bit more, if you would.
Are you saying that statements he made, and by statements I'm specifically referencing July 24th, 2013 and May 10th of 2015, are you saying that his anxiety, that what he's saying is not voluntary there at any point during either statement?
Correct.
Okay. So...
You say the entirety of what he said was involuntary on July 24th?
Yeah, I'm saying that talking about the case isn't a voluntary act on his part, and certainly not in any knowledgeable way.
Okay, so can I continue on? So let me follow up on that, Dr. Abelo. When you're saying about talking about the case, is it your testimony today that he can make involuntary statements when talking about the case during the course of those statements?
Well, certainly he can make involuntary statements because he can speak.
Right. So, but what you're saying is what he's saying about the case in those two statements is involuntary. For the reasons
That's
you
my
stated.
Understanding of why we're here today.
Right. And my follow-up question to that, Dr. Abelo, is: are there other parts of the conversations, of the statement in the conversation with the girlfriend that you could deem voluntary?
No.
No. Okay. So you'd agree with me that your testimony, your opinion, is that the entirety of the May 10th, 2015 call was an involuntary statement?
Correct.
Okay. And the entirety of the July 24th, 2013 statement was involuntary?
Yes.
So when he, for example, I just want to point out some examples. You've had the opportunity to listen to the May 10th, 2015 call?
Yes.
When he makes a comment and is engaged in conversation with Ms. Stevenson about his daughter and makes a comment to her about her haircut, and she's asking how he found out about that, that would be an involuntary statement, correct?
The fact that this conversation takes place while the defendant is incarcerated and that he even chooses to speak to his girlfriend at all, and that he is laboring under these mental illnesses makes that involuntary as well from a psychiatric standpoint.
Okay.
Yes.
So when he knows discrete details such as the fact that she had traveled, Ms. Stevenson had traveled to Florida, that would also, in your opinion, be an involuntary statement?
Taking the call and proceeding to speak to his girlfriend at all while incarcerated would be an involuntary act.
And
so
what
therefore,
part of it?
anything in the parentheses, so consider the call the parentheses, anything inside the parentheses I consider to be involuntary, as if someone were to leap off a mountain, hearing a voice saying leap off the mountain, this being an involuntary act. And then you might say, but when he picked up his shoe, was that voluntary? Well, I mean, he had leapt off the mountain because of a voice and his shoe fell off, he picked it up. But the big parentheses are that he's taking this call, trying to fill in gaps in his memory.
Well, let's be clear. He's not taking a call, he's making a call, correct?
Making a call, trying to fill in gaps in his memory, agreeing to things that might or might not be accurate, speaking about things that may or may not be germane, all under the burden of these illnesses that makes his discussion entirely involuntary from a psychiatric perspective.
Dr. Abelo.
It is as though Alemany is not there.
You had the opportunity to listen to the May 10th call, correct?
Yes.
Are you suggesting to the court that Ms. Stevenson was leading him through that conversation?
I haven't been asked to opine on that, and I don't have that opinion at present.
Okay. Would you agree with me that she sounded very upset during the phone call?
Yes.
She she wasn't expecting the call that he had placed on that Mother's Day?
It seems not.
Don't you agree that he repeatedly makes statements about what he said during the call could be used against him in court?
What statements are those?
Generally, that he said that generally whatever was said during the phone call, portions of it could be used against him in court.
I believe I recall that.
Okay. Doesn't that suggest that he was fully or could fully appreciate what it meant to withhold information during that phone call?
I don't believe so. I believe that we have someone who's so burdened by symptomatology that he is attempting to cobble together a way to interact with complex systems that would come naturally to us, but for him is like a net that has mostly holes in it and some rope connecting the air.
Okay. Fine.
So he's grasping for straws would be another way of...
But part of his way with coping with those complex systems is being able to differentiate about what he could say or shouldn't say during that call. Don't you agree with that?
I don't, actually. I
Okay.
think that he's stumbling through trying to do things that would be consistent with what you're describing, but that the man's so impaired that it doesn't bear a reasonable likeness to that.
Fine. And he's so impaired that he understands and confronts her during that call and asks her whether she'll be testifying against him.
That's correct.
In May 10th, you're aware, based on your role in this case, that May 10th was just under a week away from the commencement of the formal trial.
Correct.
And again, is it your position that he was involuntarily making suggestions to Ms. Stevenson on how to parent their child? That would be involuntary as well?
I think talking to Ms. Stevenson the entire call is what I'm referencing as not voluntary.
And with respect to the jail call of July 24th of 2013, you've had the opportunity to listen and review
Yes.
that, correct? Do you agree with me that during the course of the interview, he relays portions of how his day was filled leading up to the time of his arrest?
His version, yes.
His version. And to the extent that's actually corroborated by actual evidence in a criminal trial, would you still opine that those statements were involuntary?
I would. Mind you, I think I've already testified that him being here, seated here today, is involuntary. That was my position. It's not something that may have been seen as accurate by the court. But my psychiatric assessment was that he wasn't competent even to be part of a judicial proceeding.
Why don't you answer this question?
Well, I thought I was answering it, but...
You weren't asked the question.
Okay, sorry. What's the question?
That he was able to recall with a certain amount of specificity his whereabouts on July 22nd, 23rd, and into the early morning hours of July 24th.
Now I recall the question, and I think you went on and said, and even those statements where they turn out to be corroborated, those weren't voluntary. Correct. I don't believe those were voluntary either.
Dr. Adler, can you help me with the construct?
Yes.
If I listen to the statement, which I've done, and seen the audio tape, I'm sure you have, I've read it, he described, the police are asking what happened on July 23rd into midnight 24th, correct?
Correct.
He describes on the 22nd going to some cookout with a neighbor, correct?
Yes.
Then he says he does some certain things around the time, or at the time that Amy Wood was abducted and murdered.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
Then he describes afterwards, in the afternoon, going to the Tahiti, correct?
Correct.
And after Tahiti, he describes this stabbing by the unknown black male and the trip to Tufts Medical.
Correct.
When we've seen the evidence play out, what's been corroborated is the July 22nd cookout, correct? There were
Correct.
witnesses that say he did.
Correct.
Then what's been corroborated is the trip to Tahiti with witnesses and videotape, correct? You're aware of
Yes.
that? Then we have Tufts Medical and the Hess gas station, all corroborated.
Yes.
Can you help me where his statement is accurate as to everything around the actual events he's on trial for versus what's not corroborated? How is it that he goes in and out of voluntariness when he gives exculpatory versions to the police?
Well, so that's
And I ask you a multiple-part
No.
question, I'll give you a chance to answer it.
But I think there's one answer to it, I hope, which is that it isn't the accuracy or inaccuracy of any one statement that determines whether the statements were given in a voluntary fashion. It is that the act of giving the statements at all was not voluntary. So, to borrow a metaphor, if you had a 7-year-old who's not allowed to do a variety of things because her age is too low, but you said, but in between driving and having a beer, she played kickball and baseball, are you saying that the whole day was involuntary? Well, yeah, right, because she drove there. So I'm saying that he can't make a rational decision whether to give a statement about anything in his current state related to this case. Certainly not a jail call, certainly not an interview with police.
Even though he never admits to this crime, he gives exculpatory information to the police.
Your Honor, with respect, that's not what happened in the jail call.
I'm not talking about the jail call, I'm talking about the interview.
Okay.
Right, even though he is able to give a variety of statements, some of which are correct, we don't even know from where he drew the data that he then relates to officers, whether he has shreds of memory that he tries to assemble together, whether he picks it up from statements made by officers, and so it's my assessment, based on all the data that I could assemble, that the great weight of Mr. Alemany's pathology renders him as though incompetent or unable to do things of an adult nature voluntarily, certainly not to be speaking to police on his own behalf, nor to make a jailhouse call and address any issues whatsoever.
You've answered my question. Thank you.
Dr. Avila, when you say you don't know where he got the data, assuming for a moment those portions of the interview where he was filling in certain parts of the dates that His Honor asked you about, assuming those were true, couldn't he have gotten the data from his own first-hand account? Couldn't he be, in fact, telling the truth?
Well, since Mr. Alemany doesn't recall those events, the answer would be not.
Let's be careful what events, because I don't want to lose, right? What people say.
Right.
When His Honor asked you about the cookout,
Okay.
and he, in his statement on July 24th, talked in a certain amount of detail about the cookout. When you were talking, answering His Honor's question about where he may have gotten the data, by data you're talking about where he got the information that he provided during the interview, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So when you talk about that, Dr. Avila, let's put the involuntary, voluntary aside. Couldn't he have gotten the data because he was there?
Yes.
Yes. Your position is that no matter what he said or how he said it can't be voluntary because of his condition.
Exactly. Not in that context.
Under any circumstances.
Well, the circumstances are what they are. It's a legal moment of tremendous import, and he can't voluntarily speak under those circumstances.
You had the opportunity to view him, or listen to him at least on the jail call, correct?
Yes.
Did he appear to you to sound under duress? Did he?
I would say yes, because Mr. Alemany is chronically under duress.
Okay. Who sounded more under duress, Elizabeth Stevenson or Edwin Alemany in that
I
phone
think
call?
Elizabeth Stevenson sounded more under duress. That's, if I can add this, you can interrupt me if you wish. Part of the complicated nature of Mr. Alemany's condition is that he's seated here quietly now, but whether he's hearing voices or seeing visions, we don't know. And whether he believes that he should take some action to harm himself, we don't know.
Well,
Or why.
It's interesting you mentioned that you don't know if he's hearing voices or seeing things right now. That would also apply when he was giving the statement on July 24th, 2013, wouldn't it? You wouldn't know.
Correct. That's why that would be, but because of the great weight of data, the thousands of pages of medical records, the long history of such severe illness, I don't know of any such illness that goes away entirely for particular periods of time.
Okay.
So, yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Evans. Your testimony is he's incapable of involuntary statements regardless of the answers provided, whether they're exculpatory, self-serving, doesn't matter.
In the context that we're talking about, he couldn't,
I'm talking about July 24th.
Right, July 24th, he was there's a legal context for each of these events, the interview and the call, and certainly Mr. Alemany couldn't voluntarily decide to participate in that call or that interview. So whether the statements are accurate or not doesn't matter to me from a psychiatric perspective, because the opening of the door to speak can't be thought of as voluntary, because he's so impaired psychiatrically that he can't decide whether that's a good thing, a bad thing, something that is absolutely off the table or something he must do. One relevant thing is that preceding the crimes, the alleged crimes, and in other circumstances, Mr. Alemany's symptoms become more intense when he feels he's been rejected by a support, particularly a female. And so can he voluntarily decide not to call his girlfriend? I think not. I think he's in a free fall most of the time, but reaching out for a branch labeled female support, there's no way I think he could resist that, for instance.
Anything else, Mr. Evans?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Any follow-up? No, sir. Here's Dr. Evans.
Thank you so much.
Anything further, Mr. Denner?
No, sir.
And just so the record would be clear, as I've mentioned, I've reviewed the transcript a number of times. I've watched the video of the July 24th interview, and I listened to the May 10th interview. Are those part of the record for review purposes?
If they're not, I would ask that they be made part of the
I think
record
we should
for this
mark those.
hearing.
I have the thumb drive on the interview. When I put this into evidence for these purposes, do you have the jail call as well? I think actually I marked the jail call in relation to the competency hearing.
During the, I believe that's
I did.
correct, Your
I
Honor.
did.
Yes.
But as far as interviews, I don't think we have that. So let's make the interview part of the record. That's the jail call, so we have that. Okay. All right, so that's already marked. That's already part of this case, part of the
Yes, so it was in the motion hearing back on May 14th.
Right, but I want to make this interview. Thank you.
Your Honor, in terms of...
Excuse me.
I'm sorry.
That'll be H1.
Okay.
Would you prefer we also mark a copy of the jail call transcript for completeness, Your Honor? I mean, we have it.
Sure.
Exhibit H2.
Thank you.
Martin Kelly. Dr. Martin Kelly, excuse me.
Just pause it, picture, raise your right hand.
So do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give the court and the cause now at hearing should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you, sir.
May I inquire, Your Honor? Yes. Good afternoon, sir. Could you please just identify yourself for the record?
My name is Dr. Martin Kelly, K-E-L-L-Y.
Dr. Kelly, you've had the opportunity to appear before this court before in this case,
I have,
and was that relative to the defendant Edwin Alemany's competency?
yes.
Dr. Kelly, you've been retained by the Commonwealth in this case,
I have,
and preliminarily was that for purposes of evaluating the defendant's criminal responsibility?
correct.
Dr. Kelly, for purposes of today's hearing, are you familiar with the legal test for voluntariness of a statement?
Yes.
And could you articulate what that is for the court?
That for voluntariness, it needs to be the product of a rational mind and freely given.
And Dr. Kelly, notwithstanding this particular case, have you ever been asked to evaluate an individual to determine whether a statement they may have made was the product of that person's rational intellect?
Yes, I have.
And on approximately, not including this case, on approximately how many occasions have you been asked to do that?
I'm not good at keeping numbers, but probably in excess of 10.
Okay, and generally,
I
Dr.
will certainly stipulate that Dr. Kelly's qualifications to apply to anything that's a forensic psychiatric level.
Yes.
Dr. Kelly, what are some of the factors that you would look at to determine whether the person's statement was voluntary?
When you're looking for psychiatric conditions that might affect either the person's capacity to understand things generally, cognitive, intellectual ability to understand things, and whether they have a condition that might take away the capacity to make free choices over one's behavior.
And Dr. Kelly, relative to this particular case, you evaluated Edwin Alemany for purposes of criminal responsibility.
Yes, I did.
Did you interview him?
I did.
Did you have the opportunity to review certain mental health records?
Yes.
And did you review associated materials, case-related materials that the Commonwealth provided to you?
Yes, I did.
Did you also have the opportunity to review the reports filed by Dr. Abelo?
I have.
And most recently, before today's hearing, you were asked to render an opinion on his competency to stand trial.
That's correct.
After that hearing, the competency hearing, were you also asked to review two statements that Mr. Alemany made to determine whether they were voluntary?
Yes.
Okay.
One I had reviewed previously in association with my workup around competency and criminal responsibility, but there was new information, the Mother's Day telephone call.
May 10th of 2015? Right. And the first one that you interviewed, which statement was that, sir?
That was the July 24th statement, 2013, is a statement to the police, and I reviewed an audio plus the transcript of that.
And relative to the more recent statement that you were asked to review, the May 10th, 2015 statement, what material were you provided relative to that one?
Both the audio and the transcript.
Okay. And did you have the opportunity to review them both?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Dr. Kelly, do you have an opinion relative to the two statements, whether they were voluntarily made? Did you come to a conclusion?
Yes, I did.
And what was your conclusion, sir?
That Mr. Alemany has no psychiatric condition, no mental disease, no defect that would interfere with his capacity to make voluntary statements.
And articulate for the court, if you would, Dr. Kelly, what do you base that on?
Well, first, the question of, in an overall way, what is his psychiatric diagnosis, if any? Does he have any evidence at any time in his history of a disorder that would disrupt the capacity to cognitively understand things, or that remove from his ability to make choices about his behavior in ways that he perceives to be what he wants to do or in his self-interest? And I could find in the extensive records reviewed and in general that he never had a condition that would disrupt those two fundamental capabilities. And then when you zero in on the two particular issues, statements that are the subject of this hearing, the July 24th, 2013 statement, it is very clear that he grasps what's going on, he understands the circumstances, he understands that there are questions about his behavior and that he's under arrest, and basically gives a statement that is easily perceived as being in his self-interest. I have a complete memory of the past day and a half. There are no gaps in my memory. I did this, I did that, I went to a cookout, I went to Tahiti with my friends, etc., etc. So he's basically making a statement in his self-interest in context, and that shows not only that he grasps the situation, he develops a strategy to deal with it, and it is, in my opinion, absent any condition that might remove the capacity for doing that voluntarily.
And when you had the opportunity to review that first statement, the July 24th, 2013 statement, had you reviewed certain records from the Bridgewater State Hospital from approximately August of 2013 to approximately August of 2014?
Yeah, I'm not sure the order in which I reviewed
At some
it.
point?
At some point, yes.
Okay.
I had access to those materials. I'm not sure which order I read them in, if you will, but I did pay a great deal of attention to his mental state while at Bridgewater in the summer of 2013, the Bridgewater record of that period, correspondence to his former girlfriend. So I put a fair amount of attention on it because the question was going to be his mental state at the time of the incidents that have resulted in his charges.
And at the conclusion of his stay at Bridgewater, did you have the opportunity to review the discharge summary?
Yes, in the discharge in the summer of 2014, yes.
Yes. And what was the diagnosis relative to the existence or relative to him having any type of major mental illness?
He didn't have a major mental illness. The diagnosis was of a personality disorder, which is not a mental illness, but a description of people with certain kinds of behaviors.
Dr. Kelly, a few minutes ago you also said you had the opportunity to listen to and review a transcript of a phone call made by the defendant on May 10th, 2014.
Yes.
Did you reach a conclusion relative to the voluntariness of that particular, the statements he made during that phone call?
Yes.
And what was that conclusion?
Again, I could find no evidence in that phone call of any psychiatric condition that would remove or would indicate he didn't understand what was going on. He initiated the call. He initiated it on Mother's Day, a day that she might be particularly vulnerable. He persists in questioning her, requests that she comes to visit, repeatedly says, I can't say certain things because this telephone call is recorded. He basically says, in effect, maybe I was involved in one of the things, but not the two others, things of that sort. So, again, he's understanding fully the circumstance. He is persistent despite her distress and her wish that this was not happening. And there's no evidence that it was done other than what he thought was in his interest at that moment.
Is there anything in the records you reviewed, including the July 24th, 2013 statement, the May 10th, 2015 phone call, those two calls, the records you reviewed, your interview of the defendant, that would lead you to the conclusion that those were not voluntarily made?
No, there were not.
That's all I have for Dr. Kelly.
Good afternoon, Dr. Kelly.
Good afternoon.
Would it be fair to say nothing I'm going to say is going to change your mind?
You can ask me questions. I'll do my best.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Dr. Kelly, what of his psychiatric history of harming himself in other types of activity? Does that relate to some type of psychosis that would be relevant to this inquiry?
I don't think he has ever had a psychotic disorder. His description of it is his psychotic symptoms, his voices, his shadows are not very convincing to me. His psychiatric hospitalizations after the age of about 14 were manipulations for the most part to get out of DYS facilities. Earlier on, latency age 11, 12-ish, he was seen in psychiatric hospitals, but he's never made a serious suicide attempt. There's never been a medical hospitalization because he did something serious. Most of the suicidal acts are in the terminology of psychiatrists, suicidal gestures, they're manipulations consciously engaged in to achieve some goal, some self-interest in certain things. And it's recorded in the records as well as such that he either said he did it in order to get out of something or that was their conclusion. He's not had psychiatric treatment or hospitalization because he hasn't required it since age 18, 19.
And there are instances, where someone is psychotic, where what they say is the product of rational mind.
Correct.
But not in this case.
No.
Thank you, Dr. I'll hear you, Mr. Dunn. And the reason I didn't ask for any witnesses other than the two experts that we've had is it would have been of no input because of videos. We don't need a police officer to tell me what I can watch.
Thank you, Your Honor, and appreciated that you spent as much time listening as you have. Your Honor, basically, Dr. Adlow has expressed my position as eloquently or far more than I would, so I will rest on that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dunn.
Your Honor, I would ask you to credit the testimony of Dr. Kelly and based on your review, your thorough review of the defendant's statement on July 23rd of 2013 and May 10th of 2013. Not just on its face, the testimony of Dr. Kelly today, but also based on his thorough review of approximately 4,500 pages of mental health records, Your Honor, his interview of the defendant, and his careful and thorough review of associated case materials related to the government's case.
I'm going to take the matter under advisement. I'll write something out tonight, and I'll give you my findings on the record tomorrow.
Thank you, Judge.
All right, anything else before we break?
Judge, may I ask?
Yes.
I just want to see tomorrow.
Excuse me. I will sign.